Today, our subject is why don't we know that Africa had such an influence on the conceptualization and the knowledge that is in the Bible? Why don't we know it? Okay, Africa is mentioned over 1,000 times in the Old Testament, and we don't seem to know that. And for those who have read the Bible, you say, well, I don't remember seeing Africa throughout the Old Testament. This is not an accident. This is something that can be classified as agnotology. Agnotology is the study of misinformation. We're going to talk about today how the establishment has been able to get past the idea that Africa had such an integral part of the Bible. So, here we go. This is how they were able to do it. The Egyptian civilization starts to decline. Then, in 537 AD, by this time, Rome is in power. In 537 AD, the last remaining priest who could write and read and interpret Egyptian hieroglyphs died. After they died, no one could read Egyptian hieroglyphs. So the record is silent. But just because the record went silent, it did not stop theologians or the Christian church from developing, evolving, making their interpretations, doing their translations. All of these things are still going on, even though they could not read or access the civilization's writing that had the most influence on them. The Temple of Philae was the last point in which people could read Egyptian hieroglyphs, and then there is a long silence in which Egyptian hieroglyphs couldn't be read. All right, with that in mind, we come all the way down to the 17th century AD. In the 17th century AD, you have a man by the name of Dr. John Spencer. Spencer was the president of Corpus Christi College at Cambridge. He is a theologian, and he becomes the founder of comparative religion. This is what he did. He decided he can read the Bible just like we all could. He read the Bible and he saw that Egypt was very important. So he starts a project in which he wanted to show Egypt's relationship to the Bible. But there's a problem. No one could read Egyptian hieroglyphs. Egyptian hieroglyphs were lost in 537 AD. So what did he do? What he decided to do was to rely on Greek and Roman sources to make the connection. Even though he could not read Egyptian hieroglyphs, he was able to show the connection between ancient Egypt and the Old Testament. The sources that he used was Tacitus. Tacitus was a prefect. He was a Roman prefect, like a governor. He was a governor of Rome, and he was a governor not a governor of Rome, he was a governor of Egypt. And he was also a historian. So he writes about Egypt, and he is able to explain a lot of interesting and important concepts that Egypt had. So Dr. Spencer is reading about this in Latin because Egyptian hieroglyphs could not be read. He also uses the writings of Flavius Josephus. Many people may know Josephus. He uses his writings. He too is a Jewish Roman historian. Dr. Spencer's most important source was actually Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. He's better known as Maimonides. Maimonides is a medieval Jewish rabbi, and his interpretation of the law of Moses becomes revolutionary. Dr. Spencer uses Maimonides' work in order to make his case. In 1680, Dr. Spencer came out with a Latin text, and that Latin text was to argue just the big and great connection that Egypt had on the Bible. But there's a problem. The Christian church had already established so many doctrines, so many beliefs based on their own interpretations, an interpretation made without Egypt, an interpretation made on the text, but not from the civilization that the Bible mentions most after Israel. But Dr. Spencer came out with his Latin text, and interestingly enough, it was swept under the rug. No one translated it. To this day, it has not been translated. So what I did was I had to write to England to get the Latin text that Dr. Spencer wrote. They sent me the Latin text, and then I had it translated. I sat down with a Catholic priest to make the translation myself and him. Here being seen for the first time on video is my translation of Dr. Spencer's text. The title of the book that he wrote is 3 Books Concerning the Ritual Laws of the Hebrews and Their Rationale. In other words, the Hebrews and all of their rituals and all of their laws, they are deeply, deeply connected to ancient Egypt. Here is a translation. Here's my translation of the table of contents for Dr. Spencer. And as you can see, he goes into great detail with some of the origins and practices of the ancient Hebrews. And he's doing this all without Egyptian hieroglyphs. Then we have a break in the story. After Spencer, and his work was legendary, his work was revolutionary, his work was highly esteemed, and so many scholars agreed with him, and it's very difficult to find anybody who disagreed with his thesis at his time. But after Dr. Spencer died in the 17th century, in the 19th century, and more specifically 1822, we have the famed Rosetta Stone. Jean Champollion makes the break, and he is able to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. But it's too late. The Christian church had already made all of its doctrines, it had already made all of its beliefs, and now you have a solid empire of the Christian church in Europe, but in fact, it's absent of Africa, even though Africa had the most influence on it. But Champollion was able to decipher the script, and now we could read Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now we could go back to Egypt. We could go to the monuments and we can look on those monuments and we could read them now for the first time, and we could translate them into English. But the Christian church is already has its own beliefs. But scholars continue to translate Egyptian texts, and they began to see a lot of the connections. But this actually goes against the grain. But even though it went against the grain, they have continued. Finally, they established in 1882 the Egypt Exploration Society. In their memorandum, the Egypt Exploration Society said or cited their goal. Their goal was to use Egypt to give explanation, to help understand the Bible. That was their mission. But there was a problem. Soon, when they started to have meetings, an argument broke out between T. Eric Peat and Neville, two scholars, and one accusing each side of promoting their own beliefs. The conference, it got pretty ugly, as I understand. They started calling each other's names. It really got ugly. After that, there's a break. The break now, you have now two different disciplines. You have the discipline of biblical studies, and then you have a new academic discipline, Egyptology, and they don't talk. So therefore, you have two disciplines that relate to the Bible, and yet they're not talking to each other. So to this day, after the split, you have two different disciplines, and in our academic, our theological disciplines, the two don't cross. What we're seeing here now is a structural issue that we need to confront. An issue that says, if we really truly want to understand the biblical text, we're going to have to come to Egypt in order to do it.